Hello and welcome to the webinar, the first of three webinars we are hosting in advance of the Georgetown Global Dialogues in Rome, Italy in June. My name is Pankaj Mishra and I'm joined today by Nesreen Malik and Mohsin Hamid, two of the Georgetown Global Dialogues Fellows. And today we're going to be talking about a problem which has assumed, obviously, enormous proportions in just recent months. I think the question posed to the participants is, how's the nation state, a decaying 19th century form which increasingly asserts itself through desperate lunges for territory and resources, prevented the growth of our moral imagination? I'd probably be presumptuous enough to say the answer that both of our distinguished guests are going to provide to this question is a resounding yes. But I think it's probably also worth examining why the nation state continues to exercise such an extraordinary hold on our moral imagination. Why does it monopolize our political imagination? So we're going to be exploring some of these questions and also, possible alternatives to this decaying but nevertheless very powerful and consistently destructive political form. But let me first turn to Mohsen and ask him, um, why, first of all, does he think, or if he does think that, or maybe he doesn't, why does he think the nation state has stunted our moral imagination?
Thank you, Pankaj, and hello, Nasreen, and hello to everybody else. Um, I think, considering the nation state as a creature of imagination itself. So, we obviously have individuals, we have the various clans and tribes that we belong to. Um, and then beyond that, we have this construct of the nation state that sort of draws some kind of boundary out around us and some other people. And we then have to fill this space, the imagined space of the nation state, um, with certain values, certain connections, certain themes. And I think in the process of doing that, we wind up necessarily picking themes that can be used to differentiate us from the people who are outside that nation state. There's perhaps something inherently anti universal in the notion of the nation state. So, to make it less theoretical, if you think about Pakistan, where I've lived much of my life, Pakistan came into existence in 1947 and set about trying to figure out, what it was. And this notion of a Muslim homeland or homeland for the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent um, was arrived at. And so the Pakistani nation state began to think of itself in these terms. Initially, of course, there was the idea that those who were not Muslims were also very welcome in Pakistan. But over time, quickly it became clear that would not really work. Um, and then it became even more focused on the notion of who was a Muslim. And Pakistan became preoccupied with the question of are you Muslim enough to be a Muslim in Pakistan? And this then has really consumed, in a sense, the political imagination of the country ever since. And I give this example, and I'd love to hear what Nasreen thinks about this as well. But I give this example just to say that Pakistan's preoccupation with the idea of what kind of person is Pakistani, and because Pakistan is this Muslim country in its self-definition, who is a Muslim, what kind of Muslim, what does Muslim mean? This begins to totally preoccupy, in a sense, the moral imagination of the polity, of the people. And that starts to quite quickly preclude larger imaginings that would unite us with people who are our neighbors, unite us with people who are not Muslims. And it, I think, does have a kind of impoverishing effect. I don't want to go too far down this, but just to begin to sketch the grounds of it, I think I would open by saying, at least in my experience, that the nation state almost demands a kind of moral imagination that is exclusionary. And in its exclusionary nature, it is much less ambitious than its moral imagination, I think, could be.
Nasreen?
Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Mohsen. And thank you, Georgetown. I'm very happy to be back in the fold with the first of these events. I agree with a lot of what Mohsen has said. And I'd like to focus a little bit on what else the nation state precludes us from thinking about. And I'd move it from South Asia to North Africa and broadly the Arab world, where the nation state has become not only stifling of moral imaginations or imaginations of things that can bind us apart from our nationality, but has become a corporatization of politics, so to speak. The moment you draw boundaries and create a discrete sovereign nation state with an economy that can trade with the rest of the world, immediately you create competitors. And those competitors for power are essentially competitors for commerce. And so there's a reason why, if you look across North Africa and broadly the Arab world, excluding the Gulf states, the model of the nation state is broadly a military industrial complex. And there's a real tell in that, which is you have to, by not creating any sort of connective tissue between the people, you have to govern them with an iron hand, hence the military is the only party that can do that. But also because there are such wealth and such treasures to be mined by a sovereign military, that military therefore extends to becoming a corporate entity as well. So it's a very specific military, commercial, industrial complex that exists basically everywhere from Morocco to Egypt. And I'd like to give one specific example, sort of case in point of how the drawing of boundaries of a nation state immediately overwhelms any other notions of what that could be they moral, ideological, or even tribal. In Sudan, the country that I'm from, became independent in 1956 and was plunged into civil war immediately. And that was not a civil war that was over any kind of definition of what Sudan is. It wasn't about whether it's a Muslim country or a Christian country. I mean, it was to a certain extent about North and South, but it wasn't really about what defined the Sudanese people as a people, but about resources. The North did not want to let go of the South. The North was Muslim, the South was Christian, but that's kind of a secondary element. It was about the North wanting to control and monopolize power for economic purposes. The second phase of the Civil War, which has been intensifying in the past couple of years, is a very clear distillation of that nation state corrosiveness. The two parties that are at war in Sudan at the moment are often described as tribal or ethnic competitors. And the war has played out against ethnic lines with ethnic cleansing and a genocide, in fact, in the west of the country. But essentially, these are two parties competing for economic monopoly. There are two entrepreneurs. One is the kind of classic military, the army of the state, and the second is a paramilitary militia that wants its own slice of the cake, so to speak. And over the years, across the Arab world, and across the kind of Arab north of Africa, there has been this discourse about whether it's Islam or democracy that's going to win, sort of Islam being posited as this default of what the Arab nation state could be. But that was never really in play. Even the ideology of Islam, even the sort of basic connective tissue of religion people share, was never really allowed to become a viable mode of government because that dispersed and diffused power to a certain degree that meant that economic power also became diffuse. And so I'll stop there, but just to recap, my experience will sort of survey of the nation state as a suffocator of any kind of moral imagination. has been manifested in the regions of which I speak, mostly along economic lines, that once you create a nation state, you create an economy, you create a treasure chest, and therefore you create competitors to power and economic supremacy, which means that there is absolutely no interest or desire to find any sort of moral connective tissue between people, because that disperses and democratizes that in a way that is not desirable.
That's really fascinating, isn't it? Because so many of the nation states in Asia and Africa, I suppose you could say all of them, initially emerged, or the conception of that those nation states emerged in response to the massive inroads made into Asian and African societies by, capitalist imperialism, broadly speaking. And so the idea that, the nation state is the one political unit that is capable of standing up against these, literally in many cases, invaders. And that is the best way to protect yourself, protect your resources. But then comes the problem of like, so, okay, you got a nation state. Who within that nation state is going to then have access to those resources? Who will then wield power? And then these other questions that Mohsen identifies, like, what is the national community? Who belongs to the national community? Are you actually pure enough to belong to the national community? It turns out that you happen to belong to the wrong ethnicity and wrong religion. But in effect, Nasreen, you're saying that, you can look at this in terms of ethnicity and religion, because that's often how these divisions come into being and how they're enforced. But actually, we're still looking at struggles for economic power, struggles for political power, that in a way, I suppose, can be traced back to the time when these places were essentially broken into by people from Europe and by people from the West, broadly speaking. So I suppose we are still, in a way, stuck in that paradigm, unable to move out of it. And, we end up kind of recreating some of those pathologies introduced into the modern world by this mode of acquisition, occupation, stealing of other people's resources. And we've kind of recreated it in our little, on sort of supposedly sovereign spaces, but we know they're not really truly sovereign in that sense. Anyway, I'm just throwing this out, it just occurred to me that that's, this is a pattern that seemed to have been set a long time ago. Mohsen, did you have anything to say about this particular?
Well, I think I agree with what both of you are saying. I think it's very interesting. Building off what you've just said, Nasreen and Pankaj, where you are taking this, I think, in the moment of independence of so many countries in Africa and Asia in particular, what you see is in some ways a replication of what came before. So you were talking about sort of the capitalist imperialist empires. So many of our countries have developed their own internal versions of these things. And in the same way that, in a sense, what you're seeing is, one elite, a sort of foreign elite controlling all of these resources goes away, it's quickly supplanted by a new elite, often a military elite or some domestic, economic, political elite that takes on that role. And very quickly within the nation state, a new hinterland is discovered, some part of the territory or some group of people who can then be subjected to, in a way, the depredations of this new, self-colonizing apparatus. And so we sort of see playing out, so many dynamics that are echoes of what came before, except now those who are running and profiting from these enterprises are, people with the nationality of the nation state, but they look a lot like what came before. What I think is interesting about this is, just to slightly broaden the conversation, is to say, where do we see differences from this? And I think, for me, I think in Pakistan, the model that Nasreen has described is very much applicable. I think that is very much in play in Pakistan too. But then I look at, for example, if you were to take two different examples, one would be the former imperializing, countries of Europe, for example. How have they reacted to the nation state? because in their case, of course, the nation state was cutting off, from the empire. And I think there what we see is a combination of a desire to maintain a kind of hinterland abroad, which one can still act in much the way that the old empire acted, as well as the new mode of many African and Asian countries is to also find the hinterland within. So what you wind up seeing is, for example, French activities in West Africa, which look very colonial, even though they're no longer formally an empire. But also the regional disparities within, countries like France or like Britain, where you start to see these areas open up of disempowerment that are sort of internally exploited. And so the nation state begins to act in a way quite similarly in these different places. But I would just like to just very quickly juxtapose against another example, which is if you were to look at China. To me, China is very interesting because it seems in some ways that China's decolonization process looks a little different to me than Pakistan's. There is perhaps it was the Communist Party, perhaps it was in a sense China at the moment of independence had a contest between a group of people who might have built something much more like a Sudanese or a Pakistan style military-led industrial complex, and another group, the sort of Maoist group that had a different vision in mind. And in China, the other group won. And so we begin to see in China this alternate example of what direction it can take. China, of course, is itself very much a nation state. But I do think that the Chinese model to me is interesting because it is less clearly a replication or echo of the empires that came before. It is perhaps more in some ways, I guess, an echo of the Chinese empires that preceded the European empires that came. But I think for me, I guess what I would say is that these dynamics that we see playing out across contemporary nation states often look quite similar. And even the Chinese example, although different from the Pakistani or perhaps Sudanese example, is something Chinese will themselves, I suspect, recognize in their own historical model or paradigm going back. But nonetheless, I think whatever direction they tend to follow, and whether it is a contest over economic resources, whether it's denominated by a military elite or whatever, what I think unites almost all of these models, including the Chinese, is an inability to think in sort of universal human terms, or in broader human terms. There is this notion of putting the nation's interest first. And it's, to me, that's quite interesting that manifests whether you are a contemporary European nation state, whether you are post-colonial North African or South Asian nation state, or whether you are a quite seemingly different Chinese nation state. All of these places seem to unite. And this is where I think perhaps a nation state itself is dictating this, in trying to, in a way, reject the human in favor of the nation, which has a huge implication on what the moral imagination of these countries looks like.
Doesn't China also suggest, a very different sort of dynamic that's playing out in the West today? The example of China, rather. Because China, in one sense, is a model of a perfectly realized post-colonial nation state, in the sense that here is one nation that has actually succeeded in the aims it set out with, which is to catch up with the modern West, which is to teach the capitalist imperialists, certain lessons that they deserve to be taught, to beat them at their own game. So in all these sort of aims that so many other nation states in Asia and Africa also began with, those aims have been realized by China. And so their sense of nationality today is much more cohesive, much more confident. It helps that, the ethnic majority, it's so large. The Han Chinese, comprise more than 90% of the Chinese population. So they don't have these problems that other countries face with, so many different ethnicities represented in the in the national population, and them, contending for, and geographically dispersed and contending for power, as you say, questions of hinterland creep up. So China has become this near perfect riposte to 19th century capitalist imperialism. And in response to that, it seems large parts of the West, most remarkably or prominently, the United States, is going back to a 19th century model of capitalist imperialism, which is kind of nakedly rapacious imperialism, acquiring resources, territory, and also in a way trying desperately to identify an ethnic community that is pure. It's like, who's the pure citizen here? The question that is raised in Pakistan, like who's a pure Muslim here? Who belongs to the national community? That question is now being raised in presumably multicultural immigrant societies of the United Kingdom and the United States. And the answers that are being given, like, okay, it's essentially, people belonging to a particular ethnic group who are proper citizens. Everyone else is in some danger of having their status challenged, if not revoked altogether. England, too, is a very interesting example of a nation state that actually became very unstable once the empire disappeared. The Scots, the Irish to a certain extent, and of course the English, they were sort of once part of a unit. And with the demise of empire, its Englishness, which was never really a true identity, that's kind of emerged as a sort of core identity of the country, and is now driving its politics, its culture. I would love. I'm sorry, I'm hogging the mic too much, abusing my privileges as the host. Nasreen, I'm sure you have lots to say about this.
It is your privilege to abuse. So there's so much to pick up on. A couple of points. Just on China, I think it's fascinating that the Chinese model has broken with the sort of record, because there is another bloc across the Arab world that is as powerful and as cohesive as China. You have people. I'm always fascinated by this, by how the Arab world, from Morocco to Lebanon, right, or Morocco to Palestine, it's a gigantic swathe of land. Everyone speaks the same language. It is the largest single language speaking bloc in the world. And the variations in the Arabic language are not even that many. So even as somebody who's never visited another Arab country, you could be dropped into any Arab country and get on perfectly well. There's a lot of cultural links, historical links, religious links, and intermarriage between so many of these countries that didn't have borders between them until the kind of 1920s at the earliest, and the 1960s at the latest. And there's an anecdote that has always struck me, is that my grandmother, who was born at the turn of the century, did not know what Sudan was until she was in her 30s. She'd not heard of the kind of concept of Sudan, or didn't understand that there was a nation state. All she knew was her town and her village and her kind of direct geography, but she knew of Mecca because that's where you went once a year, once in a lifetime to perform pilgrimage. And she knew of Cairo because that's where all the kind of big charismatic leaders came from. But even, that I'm two generations removed from people who only had an understanding of the immediate context and the kind of general Arab world as a place that was their home. And the fact that that has not managed to translate into any sort of regional bloc, because there's a lot of resources, a lot of power, there's oil, there's commodities, there's incredibly strategic locations across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. None of these have been converted into anything. Despite efforts in the Pan-Arab era of finding kind of compact between Syria and Egypt, sometimes between Syria and Sudan, there's all these experiments, people saying, well, this makes no sense, we're broadly kind of similar in our attitudes. But what has happened in the Arab world is that the nation state immediately created that sense of competition, right? And that sense of distinction and therefore variegation, which didn't really exist meaningfully before. And that's because colonialism, French and British colonialism and Italian colonialism was just so powerful and made so many inroads into Arabic infrastructure and also kind of the Arab psyche. And so I just wanted to say that as a kind of example of how the nation state has managed to fracture an incredibly organically strong unit of people. That's kind of the power of the nation state in preventing people breaking their own solidarities and their own similarities between each other. And the second thing I wanted to pick up on was this concept of Englishness and how Britain has been in crisis since the demise of empire. And that's because nation states, by their nature, if they're not allowed to expand because resources are finite, if they're not allowed to expand, and that's why there's kind of so much conflict associated with the nation state, then they have to compete within themselves. And the kind of the Pax Britannica, if there is such a thing, was predicated on the fact that it had managed to extend into so many parts of the world and therefore domesticated or quieted any sort of competition at home. And also there was just enough resources to go around, and enough land and enough offices. And in a way, Britain is a really interesting example of what the nation state needs to do to survive, because there is an argument that the British bureaucracy, government, entire political psyche is designed for imperialism, designed for colonialism. And when those things lapse, it must therefore practice these things within its own borders, because that's the only way that it has been designed. And so the reason that Home Office in the UK, for example, that manages immigration and settlement, is such a stubbornly abusive and cruel organization, sometimes even victimizing people that do have British citizenship because they don't have the right paper or the right skin color. And the immigration debate, which continues to grow ever more toxic in the UK, but particularly in England, is a hangover of that time, where there was no conversation, or there was really no national crisis about sharing of resources. And once the empire lapsed and neoliberal capitalism replaced it, in order not to have conversations about how to manage these finite resources in a way that is not capitalist, you therefore have to blame outsiders, immigrants, raise the barriers even further, tighten the screws of the nation state as much as possible, and keep some people in and some people out. And so the kind of corrosion of moral imagination and what brings us together, what makes us all human, and how, if it were not for the grace of God, you would be one of those immigrants, and in fact probably were 3-4 generations before, is a concept that is not allowed to flourish and is in fact verboten, absolutely forbidden and toxic to make in the UK, because again, the nation state has made it so that there is this, going back to my original point, a finite economy, finite resources that must be managed to the benefit of the indigenous, or those who deserve that power. I'll stop there.
Let's not forget, Nasreen, the press, which remains trapped in a posture of imperialist greatness and has to keep on pretending that a very diminished, insignificant little nation state is still important in international geopolitics. And likewise, the politicians are obliged to also pretend that they are hugely, hugely important. For instance, in recent months, or recent weeks, Keir Starmer sort of, projecting this image of the European leader who's going to finally take on Putin, even if, the Americans don't support him. Anyway, I'm sure Mohsen has lots of interesting things to say in response to what you just said.
No, I thought that was fascinating what you were saying, Nasreen, and it got me thinking about, if you think of Britain in particular, and sort of the post-imperial Britain, and I remember living in London in that what feels now like this golden age, between 2000 and 2009, and at that time, there was this notion of Britain as part of the EU, and Britain sort of championing universal values, and America going a bit off-piste under George W. Bush, but Britain would be different. The massive protests against the Iraq War, suggesting the British people were against it, even if the government was for it, et cetera, et cetera. And I was thinking about all of this, and I was thinking, it's quite interesting. If we talk about imagination and the moral imagination, that it may well be that there is a stronger impulse to think in human terms and in universal terms in an imperial context and in a nation state context. So let me give you an example of this. It was in a sense, of course, the empires of the world would go and conquer places and exploit those places, but to facilitate that, of course, was this narrative that that there is this rule of law and that there is this sort of human right and the human dignity and et cetera, et cetera. And the idea that we are all, in a sense, citizens of one, at least empire or world, or there's something human, and this is deployed by empires to persuade people, because it's much easier to persuade people than to always be fighting and killing them. If you can persuade many of them, you can only have to kill a few of them. And so this sort of very persuasive gesture towards a universal human and moral imagination often was made by empires. And so, whether you think of the notion of sort of parliamentary democracy and a British style legal system that so many countries continue to have today, Britain's own self-conception as talking about universal rights, etc. All born in a way out of a kind of imperial or still imperial adjacent experience. Or the United States. The United States going from, for example, being a country that embraced, slavery and embraced the genocide of native population, embraced, many such, clearly non-universal ideas. But really, after the Second World War, when America found itself with this massive, industrial base and military bases all over the world, beginning to articulate this universal, these universal values that we are all equal, and beginning to a certain extent to feel the compulsion to enact them domestically, in the 60s and thereafter. It was America at its most imperial, in a sense, that began to have its most universal or human moral imagination. And I just want to sort of to gesture to this, because I think what we're seeing is, as these imperial countries, in a sense, retreat back into a nation state self-conception, they are relinquishing many of these universal imaginings. And what we're witnessing, in a sense, is the reassertion of these, of very, the real people, the real folk, the real American, the real English persons. They come first. There's no such thing as universal. This is all just sort of, highfalutin talk. It's really about, are you really a white American? Are you really English? This is coinciding with, in a sense, the abandonment of a kind of imperial project. And so I think it's sort of interesting to see how the imaginative retreat back into the nation state is coinciding with the abandonment of universal values, which may not have been, entirely, certainly weren't entirely, genuine and were often critical, but were nonetheless very important and very influential. And so I think, what we're seeing is that. And the last thing I'll say on this, to bring China back into the picture, is what we see is that if we are to live in a world of nation states, the biggest nation, of course, of people are the Han Chinese. And if the most effective nation states are nation states that don't have a kind of universalizing theme, and don't even necessarily feel all that attached to the idea of democracy, and you have to pick, which is your sort of autocratic nation state model, it's hard to think of what is the more compelling autocratic nation state model on offer in the world today compared to the Chinese. And so what you see, in a way, is a kind of crisis of confidence in countries like Britain and America, where there's almost an unsaid desire to imitate what people are perceiving as what is making China so successful, that it's built upon a single, group of people, that it has a kind of strong, autocratic, successful leadership model. And so, we may be finding that as we move from the era of empires to the era of nation states, the nation state that is secretly at the center of our imagining is in fact the Chinese. And what we're seeing happening in countries like Britain and America is, in a way, a sort of panicked reaction to the notion that in this world of nation states, their models may not be the best ones.
It's an extraordinary historical reversal, because that's exactly how the West or Western powers were thought of by people in Asia and Africa in the late 19th century. Like, they've mustered up such extraordinary power thanks to their cohesiveness, thanks to the fact that they're all Christians. They're all kind of, believers in one particular religion. And so we must also have a religion that manages to unite us. Hence, Islamic universalism or Buddhist nationalism or Hindu nationalism, that emphasis on religion. But now, of course, it's China that is the model of a cohesive nation state, and also, a nation state that is invested in an authoritarian model. So perhaps it's by making our political systems more authoritarian, we can at least begin to catch up to China, if not actually match it at this point. I think what this discussion is in a way pointing to is like, the modern world, which is, I suppose, built on the principle of equality, that ideal, that basic ideal, is flouted not only by the modern world's main economic system, which is capitalism, which continuously generates inequality, promises equality at different phases, never really truly delivers it, certainly not to a vast majority of the human population. And then the ideal of equality is also flouted by the main political system that the world population is subscribed to, which is the nation state. It really has no, I mean, as you say, it may occasionally give lip service to the idea during the Cold War, when it's locked into a rivalry with Soviet communism. It may say, okay, we're going to give civil rights and to the African American population. We're going to be a little bit more multicultural, tolerate immigration, tone down the racism. But once those pressures recede, you can, abandon those universalists or claims to universalism. So again, I mean, I think not a question we can tackle in the time remaining to us, or a question that can be tackled at all. But again, what are the alternatives if we left it? Can we recover that principle of equality from these dysfunctional, defunct models, whether it's of capitalism, and in this instance, the nation state? Nasreen, I trust you to answer that question eloquently and brilliantly.
You got it. I'll answer that question. But before then, I'd just like to pick up one point about the lip service paid to liberal values and equality. And I think one of the traps or the kind of curveballs that places like the United States and the UK have found themselves in is that they paid more than lip service to it. Okay, they paid more than lip service, or more lip service than they thought they were paying to notions of equality, and then suddenly woke up one day and had some very serious competitors, right? They had, a huge immigration population, or huger than they would like. There's all this moral panic in the UK constantly about how Muhammad is the most popular name in England. And the incorporation of women and people of color into the workplace. So it wasn't just it wasn't an effort that just enfranchised people in terms of voting and basic rights. It enfranchised them in the economy as well, and then enfranchised them in opinion making, and enfranchised them in ways that begins to question the tenets of these nation states. And so what's happening now is most glaringly evident in America, but what's happening now is a sort of reversal of this, because it had gone further than anyone had ever expected, right? And that notion needs to be reversed, because you must sever connections between people. Once you give disenfranchised people genuine power and genuine voices and the ability to become opinion makers and academics and presidents even, what you end up with is an expansion or enfranchisement of humanity beyond your borders, number one, and domestically across classes. And once that happens, it needs to be broken. What is happening now feels like a physical process of shattering those connections between citizens and non-citizens, between people who are in poverty, people across the world who need US aid, etc., and those who thought they never really would have to share that much. Hence, Elon Musk's phrase that the West is suffering from suicidal empathy. I think it's a really, really great expression that reflects exactly how these people or how these projects view empathy and connectivity between human beings, is that it is ultimately cannibalizing of the core. And so I think, yeah, I just think it's important to point out that lip service was thought to be lip service, but actually ended up being a bit more material than anticipated, and began to creep in a kind of moral imagination, or demands for a moral imagination beyond the kind of pursuit of happiness and prosperity. That's number one. Number two, I'll answer your question very briefly, and we'll sort it out right here and now, which is that I think the way forward is not, obviously at this point, there is no kind of mechanical, practical way forward, but I think I'm personally very encouraged by people rediscovering links between each so links between each other as human beings, but also links between each other as fellow cultural brothers and sisters. I find that there has been a sort of breaking or severing or pivoting away from our own contexts, our own entertainment complexes, our own culture, our own music, our own poetry, and our own imaginations as peoples across the world, has pivoted too long towards the West in general. And China is a good example where that has not happened. I think there's the maximum you can import, the maximum number of Hollywood movies you can import in China in a year is 10. There was one policy I'd like to apply in Africa, it would be that. But broadly, that sense of, trying to understand or trying to foment or develop more local connections, more domestic contexts, more understandings that our cultures, our contexts, our histories, our ideas, our science, our discoveries, like all these things that have been so de-emphasized in this kind of overarching Western narrative of civilization. When those are rediscovered and strengthened, I think that is a positive step. And I look at the countries most isolated by America, like China, like Iran, are the countries in which those local cultures and contexts and academias are most flourishing. So there is a tell there. I think there's a sign there of what should be done going forward. I'll stop there.
We're entering now the Q&A phase of this discussion. It's really interesting questions. I think I'm going to put the first one to Mohsen. What do you say to conservatives who argue that we have to put our own country, our own communities first, and that it is morally problematic to focus on global solidarity, that our primary moral responsibility is to those closest to us?
I think that there certainly is a very strong argument one can make that the closer that one is to someone, there's a stronger moral impulse to one's child, first of all, and then to one's immediate family, and then to one's cousins, and then to one's town and one's country, etc. So I think that underlying architecture is sort of a human architecture. I don't imagine that we have yet found a system that really undermines that architecture. That is just how human beings operate. I knew very few people who say that, well, this unknown stranger across the world is more important to me than my child, and I must do more for them. So it isn't that this is not already the operative principle of the world. I think it already is. So I think we're slightly masking something if we're trying to say that there's actually on offer a model where we are taking more care of people in distant lands than we are people in our own country. I don't think that's really on offer. I think what is being asked, though, is, are those who tell us to turn away from those who are not our immediate neighbors, either genetically or geographically, what are they offering in exchange? And I think in the same way that if one was to say that, look, if we were to trade with no one except the people in our town, we would really protect our town's businesses. But we know that, of course, that most of our towns would be very rapidly impoverished by this way of thinking. This kind of, economic or political, autarkic thinking generally tends to help some group within your autarkic community or your would-be autarkic community. So we can see this being acted out by the United States right now. You put a bunch of tariffs on countries, and you start willy-nillying, throwing up barriers to trade. And there's the notion that that this will result in some wonderful benefit for the people in the factory next door. But that has not been proven at all. In fact, what we're seeing instead is likely the destruction of enormous productive capacity, and also the destruction of well-being in one's own country through inflation and through political despotism and other sorts of things. I think that the counter to that position that has been put on offer is in the same way that we know inherently that we are better off trading with others, that each household should not make everything that it uses. It will be much poorer than if it were to trade with other households. In a similar way, I think countries are better off trading. And trading not just in terms of their goods and their services. And of course, America is a massive service exporter, which is not acknowledged in these huge imbalance conversations. But not just in goods and services, but also trading in ideas, trading in affections, trading in cultures and food. We discover enormous richness in these things. And so I think that for me, you take what sounds like an obvious point, love more those closer to you. You assume that this is not widely held when in fact it is widely held. And then you pervert it into a sort of its obverse, which is, hate more those who are further from you. I don't think that the second necessarily follows from the first. It's entirely natural to love those closer to you and still be very open to meeting, engaging with, joining forces with, perhaps marrying those further away. But I think what we're being told, in fact, is not that. It's not that it's somehow a betrayal of our immediate people to venture down this path. It is rather that what we are seeking to do, in a sense, is to do the project really of Pakistan, to get into the question of who is Muslim enough, and to then parse that in ever more slender slices until we have no idea of who belongs to our community at all. And I think that is the end result of the journey that we're being offered in that state.
Nasreen, would you like to?
Yes, I have a slightly more cynical answer to this, which is that you have to take care of others because you kind of have no choice, because we're too connected. This is two contexts. Globally, we are too connected. Now, for us to be able to ring fence conflict, starvation, climate change episodes away from us, there will always be blowback. Either blowback politically because of political movements, radical movements, breakdowns, etc., elsewhere, or a blowback that comes from refugees, immigration, mass movement of people across the world that, even despite the really high barriers and cruelty, still manage to cross because human beings would like to seek safety. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in a domestic context, it is impossible to ring fence those who are further away from you, away from your own life. If there is a context in which people are suffering the privations of capital, unemployment, poverty, greed, etc., they will not languish in quietude. There is a reaction to this stuff, and a very good example of this is South Africa, where in order to oppress and kettle an entire population. The white population had to erect further higher walls, much more security, a city within a city, cities within cities, with their own security infrastructure because they had so impoverished and deprived, and kind of created nihilism and anarchy outside of the system that was so organized and bound them so well in law, that inevitably people who are hungry, people who are desperate, people who are ill, see this state of absolute injustice and inequality, and there will be breakdown. And so there is a certain prophylactic element to it, right? In order to prevent breakdown, in order to maintain the kind of security and law and order and all the things that people, right wingers, love to talk about all the time, you have to make sure that there are not significant parts of the population that are so carved out from the law and security that binds us and the conditions of health and safety and prosperity, and particularly of your own children, then people will take matters into their own hands, or they will turn to drugs, or they will turn to, any sort of thing that will allow them to survive or handle their misery. And so this question, I find, is one that is always assumes that the millions of people that we're not going to help will just sort of accept that and be like, okay, well, we tried, as opposed to being human beings that have human impulses and the right to survive in different ways. And so it might sound like a slightly sort of nature red and tooth and claw answer, but that is fundamentally what the right believes in, and it is true that if we all are out for ourselves, then you have to factor that in as well when you make these decisions.
Yeah. Well, both of you really. Sorry, go on, Mohsen.
I would just like to layer onto what Nasreen, I completely agree, onto what Nasreen has said, one more dynamic. As a species, we are becoming enormously more powerful as we master technology. And as our power grows, as individuals, as a species, our ability to isolate ourselves from each other diminishes. Someone can do a biological experiment in Mongolia or in Uruguay, and it can affect the entire planet. We are changing our environment. We are doing so many things. We are unlocking enormous destructive potentials. And we have immediate communication. We have incredible logistic capacities. So as our power grows and our technological power grows, and particularly among those who fetishize technology, I think fetishizing technology in a moral sense can be quite disastrous. But those who fetishize the technology very often shirk the moral implications of this, which is this technology binds us much more closely together because our power as individuals and as societies and communities is growing enormously. We can't really be far away from each other in the way that we could 1,000 years ago, or even maybe 100 years ago. And so this technological reality demands, in a sense, an urgent moral response that encompasses all of us, some kind of moral system in which we can live together. Because Nasreen's point of red in tooth and claw, it certainly is that. But the teeth and the claws are growing, at exponential rate in their power. And so it is very strange to imagine a world of incredible technological progress with trillion-dollar companies. That is also a world where we can simply ignore people, next door or across the planet, and they will have nothing to do with us. It just doesn't work. So I think that our technological moment also demands a kind of moral response, building upon what Nasreen just said.
And that is the kind of challenge the conservatives want to deny or to shirk or to mock, a kind of challenge that basically invites us to expand our capacity to empathize, to feel solidarity. And as you say, turning what is actually a perfectly normal situation of, instinctive empathy with those closest to you, turning that into essentially an ideological sort of, almost a kind of weapon. This is like, we're not doing this enough. let's start doing more of this. Spend far too much time feeling global solidarity for people who are actually probably out to do us harm on the whole, and are potentially our enemies. Anyway, this leads on to excellent next question, quite a provocative one. Isn't nationalism here to stay? And if it is, shouldn't we spend our time trying to reimagine the nation and not move beyond it? Again, I think something I said earlier about the staying power of nationalism remains quite an intellectual and political challenge. You know, people do still revert to it. It's a sort of default mode. I suppose you need some kind of a buffer between yourself and this world at large. And the nation state is still a kind of shelter for those feeling homeless or those feeling unprotected or defenseless. So is there any possibility at all of trying to reimagine this hollowed out thing and trying to fill it with some kind of positive moral content? Nasreen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, not in the short term, for sure. But I think there is the fact that the question is being asked, I think, and the fact that there is, particularly in light of the events of the last couple of weeks, there is an understanding that you have to divest from a world in which nation states can accrue so much power that they destabilize your local economy, essentially, right? Just by waking up and making a decision one day. And what I hope will come from that is an understanding that you need more regional solidarities and groupings, right? You need to find a way to understand that because of the kind of particularly acquisitive nature of the nation state, and how many nation states already exist in the world that sit upon stockpiles of nuclear weapons and huge commercial and economic power, that this kind of is not sustainable with the rise of nationalism. There's a sort of intersection of these two things. One is going up and the other is going down, right? And that you have a kind of decrease and erosion of democratic norms and the rule of law, and along with that, an increase in nationalism and protectionism and parochialism. And that should be an alert to the world that it's sort of quite risky to allow nation states to rule or become superpowers without there being any sort of kind of commensurate or proportional power. There's no country that has the same kind of superpower that the US has or that China has, but there are regional blocs that can be created. And actually regional blocs in the EU that already exist that are not exercising their power, actually, to erode the kind of power of the single nation state that's inflicting so much damage at the moment. So I think in the short term, no, but I think that the rise of nationalism within powerful nation states is a very good wake-up call, because you see how open to capture the nation state is, and how dangerous that capture is with the design of the nation state as a sovereign that commands so much power and can inflict it on others and draw geographic lines and upend global economies overnight. And so, yeah, I would say that the inverse is true. Because nationalism is here to stay, we need to start thinking very seriously about how to create blocks that are a bulwark against it, because the stakes are way too high.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think very quickly, just to build on what Nasreen said, I think we're too often presented that there's sort of two levels of the imagination. There's kind of the nation and sort of the planetary or global levels, and that the nation must now rise because the global is whatever. But there are at least two other levels that are very important. One is the level between the nation and the planetary, which is the regional level, which Nasreen has spoken about. And the second or fourth of these levels, but the second less considered level is, of course, the local level. What we see is very often the reduction of power and governance at the local level, at the level within the nation of your province or your city. And I think that is also a domain So if we are feeling that people feel this lack of control of their lives, it may be that instead of thinking about how do we move from a global model to a national model is the wrong question. We may find that in fact there is a local level which is desperately underserved. And that local level can best exist inside a regional environment that has diminished the conflict between nation states in the first place. So I would say at the level of imagination, we should think a lot, not just about global and national, but instead about the regional that in a way disarms the dangers of the national and allows the local imagination to then flourish.
Thank you, Mohsen. And there have been, I suppose, experiments in the past which didn't survive, but I think they're still worth thinking about, a way to organize these regional groupings where, I suppose conflicts and sometimes very old conflicts between nation states can be more or less permanently diffused. I mean, I think European Union is an excellent example of that. And there have been other such proposed federations and alliances, which allow, as you say, local participatory democracy to interact with these kind of regional institutions without, getting trapped by the zero-sum game that nation states are best, playing at. But anyway, thank you so much. We've run out of time, unfortunately. But those of you joining in should know that we have a second webinar coming up. And there we'll be taking up the question, actually somewhat related to this webinar, about individualism and whether individualism has led us astray. And we'll be joined then by Ranjit Hoskote and H.A. Temulkaran, and that's on the 22nd of April, same time, 9 a.m. EDT. So look forward to seeing you then, and thank you again, all of you, for joining us, and special thanks to Nasreen and Mohsen.